So again, welcome everyone. My name is Lisa APONTE-SOTO. I am with Tanoma Consulting. I'm the founding president and CEO. Tanoma is a national nonprofit consulting firm that provides transformative, culturally responsive research, evaluation, and training services to advance health education and workforce equity to foster equitable practices for all communities. I am a member of the CREA affiliate faculty researcher team, and we're based in the Chicagoland area. If you could please take a moment to introduce yourselves, just your name, your affiliation, where you're based from today, and a land acknowledgement as I have done so earlier on in the chat, and you can reference those prompts in the chat as well. But again, welcome. Before we begin, we want to take a moment to introduce our esteemed speakers for today's session. Ms. Angelique Tucker-Blackman, and please help me with your name. I'm so sorry. I don't want to say it incorrectly.
That's okay. Cirecie, and the last name is West Olatunji.
Cirecie West Olatunji.
Yes.
And Dr. Blackman, and is it Dr. West Olatunji?
Yes.
Dr. West Olatunji are both with the Innovative Learning Center. Dr. Blackman is with the Innovative Learning Center, and Dr. West Olatunji is with the Xavier University Center for Traumatic Stress. And a few things to highlight about Dr. Blackman. She is the CEO and Director of Research and Evaluation at the Innovative Learning Center. ILC is an education, research, and data management firm. Dr. Blackman earned her PhD in educational studies with an emphasis in science education from Emory University. She has a Bachelor's of Science and Master's of Science degree in analytical chemistry from the Georgia Institute of Technology. She completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship in cultural anthropology and was trained as a quantitative scientist, but specializes in qualitative research methods and analyses. And she has a quite impressive resume and list of accolades and qualifications. And Dr. West Olatunji, I do not have a bio for you to share with folks, so I'd be happy to circulate one afterwards. They are speaking on today, as I hand over the mic to them. They're speaking on today on Dysconsciousness and transformational learning reflections of cultural hegemony in STEM education and evaluation.
I think Victoria is going to queue up the video.
Yes.
Okay.
And I will put a short bio in the chat.
Thank you very much.
Hello, and welcome to our session. We are going to share with you a video, and then we'll engage in a very lively conversation about our presentation. My name is Dr. Cirecie West Olatunji, and I'm a faculty member at Xavier University of Louisiana in New Orleans. And I'm here with Dr. Angelique Tucker-Blackman.
Good afternoon and welcome to our presentation. I'm Angelique Tucker-Blackman. I am at the Innovative Learning Center here in Atlanta, Georgia.
So today we're going to talk to you about dysconsciousness and transformational learning. And what we'd like to do is start by talking about what many of us are already familiar with, and that is, what are the issues surrounding underrepresented students in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics? So when we talk about underrepresented students, we definitely are talking about students of color, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and Asian Pacific Islander students. We're also talking about first generation students and also women, female students in STEM, and the issues that we've had in terms of broadening participation in those areas. Now, there's a lot of time and effort and research that has been invested in this particular issue, but it persists. So one of the things that has been of interest lately has been this issue of racialized cognitive and non-cognitive variables that influence these students, as well as the faculty who teach them, and the ability of the instructors to critically reflect and learn from their own experiences within this highly racialized, hegemonic learning environment. So in thinking about that, we need to go beyond this idea of methods and materials and look at some new and transformational ways to work with underrepresented students in STEM. So when we take a look at what work has been out there, and a lot of it has been funded publicly and privately to try to address this issue, there's been an emphasis on mentoring, that there should be mentoring programs. And the mentoring programs have been with professionals who are out there, professionals of color, professionals who represent some of the underrepresented populations. It's also been mentoring of advanced students. So for instance, having undergraduate students to mentor high school or secondary school students. So there's been a lot of research around that. Also, there's been research around instructional methods and content. So thinking about how do we teach the STEM areas, and what are some of the more innovative methods used for instruction, as well as what types of things do we need to cover in STEM education. Another area that's been researched is the integration of technology, of STEM technology in the classroom. So scholars have thought, well, maybe if we were to get certain equipment that students could use as they are learning the content, that might be helpful as well. Thinking that maybe the more affluent school districts or private schools have access to this kind of technology, and it's very helpful in decreasing the gap. And then also there's been research around extracurricular activities, meaning students are able to maybe take field trips to manufacturing companies, to maybe aerospace engineering locations and things like that, that would help them to be more motivated to persist in these areas. When we think about girls, pretty similar in thinking about maybe having positive role models, and that's been important, and also thinking about socioeconomic status and girls, and trying to increase the experiences for more equity. But we haven't really explored some other aspects of the experiences that relate to a sense of belonging for these students, or thinking about what's the racialized context for them in these environments. So one of the things that we posited is that really a lot of the work that's come out has focused on the what are we doing with them, and how are we doing it? But when we bring in another discipline, I think that's where I enter into this conversation, and we think about behavioral scientists, for example, we tend to ask why questions. And those why questions are really where we are right now in bringing you this concept of dysconsciousness. So dysconscious racism involves a deep identification with an ideological viewpoint, and it doesn't allow for any alternative. Now that comes from Dr. Joyce King, who is an endowed chair at Georgia State University. She's also a past president of AERA, the American Educational Research Association. And way back in the early 1990s, she was talking about dysconsciousness and what it has to do with how the dispositions of students in classrooms. She wasn't even thinking about STEM at the time, but she was talking about this issue. And so it's important to understand that people of color in particular can internalize these negative messages that about themselves and their reference group. And so then they have an affinity for attitudes and beliefs and worldviews that are counter and are disruptive to their advancement. And they can feed into this dysconscious racism. So unconsciously, people of color, faculty of color in STEM can demonstrate this dysconscious reflexivity in which they have this, they are triggered by the students with whom they have relationships, whether they're instructors and their teachers, or they are advisors, or they are administrators, but they get an automatic reaction that they're not aware of. And so that's what we're bringing to you today. We offer you this continuum where on the one hand, we have STEM faculty who are self-aware, meaning they apply their self-knowledge. They know who they are and they embrace that and they apply it to the circumstances in their professional lives as well as their personal lives. They use remembrance for coping and resilience. In other words, they don't try to discount certain things. They don't try to gloss over negative experiences. Instead, they remember them and they learn from them in order to cope in the present and the future. And they also reflect a self-appreciation and identification with their reference group. On the other end of the continuum, you get dysconsciousness, where an individual demonstrates minimal self-knowledge. They express dismembrance. Just think about that term, right? And they reflect denial of self and minimal identification with their reference group. So we'd like to begin our discussion today with an understanding of these definitions. So when we think about dysconscious reflexivity, we are referring to the psychological and emotional stressors that STEM educators and practitioners experience when engaged with underrepresented students in their interactions. And we understand that they might serve as a trigger. And anticipatory stress, where they think about it in the future and just thinking about and anticipating their interactions, that it causes stress for them.
Thank you so much for those definitions on dysconsciousness, reflexivity, Dr. Olatunji. I am now going to provide some examples, but before I do that, one of the things we want to do is to think about how dysconscious reflexivity changes the nature of STEM education. And one of the things that we are becoming increasingly aware of through a study of the literature is that it can inhibit efforts of diversity and inclusion in STEM education. And so it's an opportunity for STEM education and evaluation to include the expertise of behavioral scientists, and so that they can be in the space to see instances and occurrences of when dysconsciousness may be taking place across a faculty member or a student, and mediate those situations so that program implementation isn't at risk or begin to crumble. So basically, one of our suggestions is that STEM educators need to collaborate with behavioral scientists, cognitive neuroscientists, and social scientists in the development of high quality STEM education programs. Next slide. This particular example, and we have numerous examples of instances of dysconscious reflexivity. They all are empirically based, but just as a reminder, dysconscious reflexivity refers to the subconscious response of participants when discussing stress-related events that invoke trauma. So at a workshop for STEM educators, the facilitator introduced a hands-on activity, gave the participants a set of instructions, and basically told the participants that they couldn't use certain materials to complete the activity. During the debriefing session, numerous comments were made as participants reflected on their experience. Some of the participants thought that it was unfair that they couldn't use certain tools. Some of the participants said that it wasn't nice that the facilitator took tools away and that they felt like they were being set up for failure. One participant in particular made the statement, "I almost didn't come today. I go to these types of events and it brings back bad memories of people telling me that I'm the first person of color to take this class, and you might not make it. I sometimes didn't, but I eventually earned my PhD." And this participant earned her PhD in a STEM area where there are few people of color earning PhDs in this area. This participant went on to talk about how when students complain that sometimes when students complain that things are hard, this person says that they sometimes shame students to get them to perform. So one of the things that we see in this shaming is that it's indicative of the professor's own struggles with surviving a traumatic ethos of significant others about her abilities. So another example, an engineering professor is recounting experiences where the professor says, "The person who has answered all of my really hard questions, raise your hand." This student, now professor, indicated that her hand was raised and that the professor looked all around the room, recognizing that her hand was raised, but refusing to acknowledge her. So this student said, "I eventually had to accept that he was never going to acknowledge me as a person who was answering the hardest questions." Next slide. Applications to our work as faculty and in evaluation. Our findings suggest that underrepresented engineering educators, African-American faculty specifically, may not sufficiently possess the words and contextual knowledge to be able to process and articulate their previous and current experiences in educational environments that devalued their contributions and academic talents. These faculties may also be unaware of how their prior experiences with microaggressions and implicit biases during their training may prohibit them from effectively mentoring, advising, and instructing underrepresented students. Next slide. So some takeaway messages from this presentation. And these are recommendations for evaluators to consider some pitfalls that may occur as you are designing or executing evaluation studies. STEM-based programs designed only by STEM people may have limitations. STEM-based programs designed by educators and engineers in the absence of experts in behavioral sciences, social sciences, youth development, and/or educational psychologists are not attending to the nuanced experiences necessary to increase and sustain engagement of students in STEM. Program designers have not fully considered ensuring that students have positive vicarious experiences with scientists and mentors, which would circumvent dysconscious reflexivity, meaning that there's an intentional design so that students aren't triggered or so that faculty aren't triggered. And if these are anticipated, then there are activities that can help kind of counter this triggering. Next slide. And so in closing, we want to give you a way to reach us. And here's my contact information, ablackman@ilearningcenter.education. And on the next slide is Dr. Olatunji's contact information. She's at Xavier University in New Orleans, Louisiana. And with that, Dr. Olatunji, would you close us out?
Absolutely. So now that you've had an opportunity to hear what it is that we're saying that we believe will transform STEM education, we invite you to a very stimulating conversation with us here at the CREA conference. And if you have any questions later after the conference ends, please feel free to reach out to us. So let the conversation begin. Thank you so much, and we look forward to talking with you.
Fantastic. So much to digest, so much to think about, so much that resonated with me personally on so many levels, particularly your dysconsciousness continuum, and thinking about embracement, right? And how we can better embrace or perhaps teach youth to reflect on the importance of embracing their whole selves by teaching them about their history. Often in working with youth, that's what I've heard many of them say, that that's what really helped them kind of get that push or that motivation to not want to be a statistic, by realizing, right, where they've come from and the struggles and the challenges that individuals from their community have made and the sacrifices that many people have made to get us to a place in a space where we have some privileges, right? Where we continue to strive for equity. So with that, any questions for our esteemed presenters?
I see Ashley has asked the first question. What are some examples of triggers of dysconsciousness? There's a full range. I think that would be a great paper to be able to just list some of the things, because so often they're just in interactions that people are having. And it seems so normal, so organic to the experience. And oftentimes we, as evaluators, or even as advisors, people in the community, we are looking for something big. We're looking for some big traumatic event. But a lot of the triggers that occur are just your everyday interactions, things that we often talk about, like Dr. Daryl Wing Su, who is a counseling psychologist at Teachers College, Columbia, right? So he's written a lot about microaggressions. And this is work that's building on a psychologist named Chester Pierce, who did this work back in the 80s, right? But it's a continuation of this discussion about microaggressions and the impact of these small things on people and their ability to cope, their ability to be resilient. So it's the small things. And I'm gonna come back to that small thing again. So one of the examples would be just seeing students of color can trigger for faculty, staff, advisors, and research supervisors, and so on. So I'll give you an example of that in the reverse. I remember when I was teaching at a PWI, and I would sit in my office and there would be this small number of students of color in the program or even in the college, right, in the building. And they would take a wide, berth around my door. So they don't want to be associated with a faculty member of color. They don't want white faculty to think that they're associated. So my very presence, I haven't even opened my mouth. I haven't said anything. They don't know anything about me, but my very presence is triggering for them and demonstrating their relationship to themselves, right? And the way in which they relate to themselves. So we often might write and talk about that, but we don't turn that lens around to take a look at how faculty are triggered by students. So that very thing of looking at students of color and thinking about a bad experience that you had, right, of coming through a program can serve as a trigger. So that's one. Just the very presence of students can trigger faculty to demonstrate self-denigrating attitudes, right? Another would be how the student is proceeding through the program. So if the student has questions, the student isn't clear, or if the student is being marginalized, right? Being that student who is getting the highest score. I don't know how many times we found that in our research, that students are saying, yeah, they're the one who got the highest score. And the professor keeps talking like, oh, and who could that student be? Meanwhile, the student has his or her hand up. It was me. But the professor doesn't see them at all, doesn't see their hand up, and just keeps talking over them. So observing a student having that experience can also trigger. It could be sitting in office hours and a student expressing their concerns about, how they're experiencing their lack of a sense of belonging, which has been studied, right? And talking about that could have a faculty member or an advisor or so on to think about their own experiences and not relate or disrelate. So it's almost going in the other direction. Not only do they not relate, they can actually have hostile feelings that are directed toward the student. And so those are just a few that are besides some of the examples that Dr. Tucker Blackman has talked about today, but we have tons of them from our research where we've collected data related to STEM. I think we talk a lot about engineering. I noticed that we mentioned engineering. Yeah, we're pointing them out, and it's because the research has shown that they are the most elitist. Even white male students experience trauma in engineering programs. That's how elitist they are. And so even though we are specifically talking about underrepresented students who then become scientists in the field, who become engineers in the field and so on. So we are talking about them, but this would also be true even for white male students, for the mainstream students coming through, because engineering has such a history of distancing just students, period, in those programs. So I think we tend to pick on them for that reason. But I just wanted to mention that the examples of this triggering go from the most commonplace kinds of things like viewings, just looking at students, to very specific, big traumatic experiences that we can give you examples of.
And there's a request for if you could please repeat the name of the persons whose new work is on microaggression.
Doing it now.
Or perhaps just enter it right in the chat so that they can grab it from there. Any other questions? No,
I saw some heads nodding when I was talking, and I wonder,
can folks
have they
unmute
noticed
themselves?
this?
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, I just said I saw some heads nodding when I was talking, and I wondered if some of those folks wanted to share what they were tapping into.
So we have a question from Dr. Cummings, and she's saying, hi, how are you? The culture sometimes in STEM focuses heavily on hierarchy and competition that we normalize through our own training. What do you suggest we do as faculty to break the cycle of trauma? It's a very good question.
Were you gonna?
Oh, you know, I was just so thoroughly enjoying your feedback, your response. I think my response would be to do more to normalize what actually really happens in productive work, which is a lot of collaboration. So we can pretend like we are advancing through the competitiveness of our own selves, but that's not as close, actually is nowhere near close to the truth. And so as we see instances of, you know, people taking singular credit for things, but those around them knowing full well that they contributed in some kind of way, because those of us who feel left out, because this is what I'm doing now, I start to say, can you give me a little credit? You know. So, you know, and it's Angelique's way of advocating for myself first, and then secondly, putting people on notice that okay, let's function as close to the truth as we can. And then in terms of the cycle of trauma, that's something that I've been doing because it felt cold to be left out. That's where that lack of sense of belonging comes from. So that's a form of trauma, to feel left out, right? So what do you do to reverse trauma? You feel the embodied experience. Don't pretend like it's something that it's not. Name it for what it is, acknowledge it, and then do some of what we talked about in our presentation, to acknowledge yourself, the reality, and then to move forward. So these are practices that really require internal knowledge of what you're experiencing, and then self-agency. We spend a lot of time talking about advocating for others, and I love hearing those conversations. But then the first person I ask, who do you advocate for first? And then the conversation is about students and about everybody but the person. And then I give a suggestion that the first person you have to know how to advocate for is yourself. And that is a process of self-healing. So that's a kind of long answer to what I would say as a suggestion.
Mm-hmm. Also, one of the things that came out of one of the studies that you and I worked on, Angelique, is that we need to help STEM faculty by providing them with decision trees. So we recognize that works, because if we say we want to talk about touchy-feely kinds of things, faculty are going to react to that and say, we're not therapists, we're professors, we're here to train these folks and to train the best. And so I think what Dr. Sperling is saying, this idea that it gets labeled as rigor, so nastiness gets labeled as rigor. But what we have to say, coming from the National Academy of the Sciences, is they're saying that doesn't work. We are not getting the brightest to come forward to get that level of creativity, right, and ingenuity that is needed for us as a nation to be able to compete. And that's where I like to go. Whenever I have these conversations, I start there with, hey, that's not me, that's National Academy of Science. And they say, we will not as a nation compete until we bring that level of diversity and creativity to the table for ingenuity. So that suggests what we're doing is not allowing the brightest to rise to the top. So what we're doing is presuming we know who is the best and who's gonna make it. And we do that as early as kindergarten. We've done that research too. Done it as early as kindergarten. Teachers are deciding which of those kids in kindergarten are gonna be something. And we do it all the way through that pipeline. And what we get is this elitism, right? This hierarchy that says that people somehow magically know who is the brightest and so on. And so that method is not working. But I find that when we talk about having a decision tree that STEM instructors can use and advisors, so that if a student comes to them and says A, they look at the decision tree and they say the response to A. And if then the student says something else, then this is what you say. We found that worked very well. So they don't have to think that they're becoming therapists. It is within the realm of what they do as supervisors, advisors, and instructors, and they can rely on that. But there still needs to be, I think, administrators at a university buying in to this idea that they will enhance all of their STEM programs if they provide some restitution, they provide some recovery for all of their STEM faculty. They've gone through a lot, and no one has stopped to say, what do we need to do to help them to be better members of our faculty? But what we found is those decision trees sort of was a very concrete response to what needs to be done. I have noticed, because NSF is my community, I have noticed that there's more research and there's more grants that involve empathy in engineering. So that discussion is happening. That's a window that's opening. And so I suggest anyone who is interested in what we're talking about, NSF is interested. So if you're interested in this idea of trying to do some healing in STEM with anywhere along the pipeline, NSF is interested. There is precedence for it. And I encourage you to keep the work going. Just keep going. I'd love to see this work continue in STEM.
We have a few more comments and questions that you can check out in the chat. There's a comment by Rick Sterling with regards to the field of psychology. And he says in his world, oftentimes wannabe STEM, it's called rigor, and how that can be dangerous, right? And we often hear that comparative of what's considered rigorous or not. And we can even think about an evaluation and research and what's considered quantitatively sound as being more rigorous versus qualitative data. And that's something that actually resonates with me, because I bring that into the classroom when I teach research methods, just to make sure that the students know that there is value in both. And I feel like things are shifting in that direction. I don't know if you have any thoughts that you want to add to that. We have some more comments and questions as well. Ashley Williams says, it seems that some of the triggers could also serve as motivators, but that the reaction would be different for everyone. For example, whereas seeing a person of color in a similar situation may be triggering for some, I would imagine that it could be motivating for others, sparking a desire to ensure that the next person's experience is different. So the question is, does the literature speak to this to some extent?
Not directly, no. So the easy answer is go for it. We are right at the ground level of talking about this issue of dysconsciousness and dysconscious reflexivity, specifically in STEM. So I would say just go for it. I remember, but back in the early 2000s, when we were talking about positionality, and people thought, nobody was going to talk about that in STEM. They couldn't understand it, and they certainly wouldn't fund it. And now positionality is all over. So that is fantastic to see that. I would like to see the same thing, that 10 years from now, all of you have gotten NSF grants that relate to dysconsciousness and dysconscious reflexivity, so that it is commonly expressed and also in the call for proposals. There are other things, though. For instance, there's research in psychology that talks about grit, and that is a resilience-based kind of perspective on talking about coping. Certainly, when you take a look at the research around historical trauma, that also, I think, resides in the social sciences of looking at that. Some of Joseph Gahn's work of Indigenous people in Canada and the US, and looking at that, that is a resilience-based perspective in talking about how people have dealt with trauma. And one of the things I've written about is transgenerational resilience, rather than focusing just on the trauma, but looking at transgenerational resilience and how people are very resilient. So there are people talking about how we, made a way out of no way from all these different lived experiences that we have. That's true. But in terms of this idea of dysconsciousness, no. And I would say that that's an area that should be explored in talking about the absence of the problem, of looking at those folks in STEM who, despite those negative experiences, have used those triggers as motivators. I think that would be a fascinating study.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'd like to add that this conversation that we're having today, September 29, 2021, Dr. Olatunji and I have been having for the past 17 years. So my talking with her, her listening, and we trying to figure out how we're going to do something about this recalcitrant problem in STEM of how people are treated, has been a 17-year-old long conversation to try to extract the appropriate terminology so that people wouldn't, again, marginalize the fact that you don't have to use rigor as a guise for abuse of another person. And that's what I know was happening because I experienced it for myself. So just having the resilience, the transgenerational resilience to say, we will do something about this. Not sure how long it's going to take. Look like it's going to take now 30 years. But it is work that is needed. The entirety of STEM is comprised of people, the entirety of it. And so the absence of behavioral scientists and others in the core construction of programming involving people has been something that has been, for me, just boggling. It's like, how are we supposed to, we all are people, right? So anyway, I just wanted to share that this conversation isn't brand new. It isn't 5 years old. It's been ongoing for many years.
Very good point. Now, I wanted to touch on what you were just speaking of in terms of resilience, because it made me think of, right, we've continually heard about the value of resilience, and we hear it with children as well, right? When trauma happens or traumatic experiences take their course, that we always hear like, oh, children are so resilient, or they're the most resilient beings. But there's been some, I feel like, more recent criticisms about how resilience, particularly in communities of color, when we talk about systems and structures, can give sort of an out, right? Putting the onus back on the people who are being marginalized. Do you have any thoughts on that?
My thought, because done the resilient, show the people you can do it, show the people who don't think you can do anything that you can, show the people who believe in you that you can. There is a U-turn for resiliency. There is a point of diminished return, and it starts to show up in your health, in your stress responses, in your anticipatory stress. It is just not something that we should be perpetually, from infinity, doing. That's my response. You can do it for 20 years and be 50, and you will then realize that I've been being resilient for 25 years, and the outcomes are showing up in all kind of health issues. And this is in the literature as well. So we're not, I think it has some diminished return. And you're right, I agree that it is placing the onus of what should be a high quality programmatic experience. It's putting the burden on people trying to advance. And then you come into a low quality, half prepared, half baked program. And then if you don't make it through that, you are blamed. So that's my response.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Very
I
good
think it
point,
also
Tamara.
speaks to the macro issues, and that when we talk about what students are dealing with, that we need to see them within the context of their environment. And there is no way to get around racism in particular, and how that impacts every aspect of a child's life. So someone asked about training, I think it was Veronica Smith, Dr. Smith. So during COVID, I just got tired of looking at all the issues, and I contacted a colleague of mine, and we created online training that is all about countering race-based stress for Black children in particular. And it is for educators, for clinicians, and for parents of Black children. And that is what we do. We just educate to give people the tools that they need to promote excellence among children. And the emphasis is always on, this is the context in which children live. And these are the mechanisms, huge macro systems that are impacting them all the time. And it's just not possible. We know that as adults, that we can wake up and say, I'm going to make this a good day. I'm going to be productive. And a series of things can have you ready to go for a drink somewhere at the end of the day. And this is with all of the tools that we have as adults to try to counter that. But there are a lot of things that are not in our control. We can't control when we call up on the phone and get customer service and people are treating us a particular kind of way. We can't control that. We can't control our interactions with people, people we work with, and so on. And so it becomes very difficult. So we don't want to put the onus on children. We want to think about what can we do systemically, behaviorally, immediately, and materially to be able to assist students to do the very best that they can. One of the examples that I give to my students in counseling, because people like to talk a good game about social justice, but the rubber meets the road when people are willing to commit to do something to stop the hurt from happening. And I would say to them, if you were walking down the street and a branch fell on somebody and they're laying down on the road, are you going to ask them to tell you how they feel about it? Or are you going to get the branch off of them? What are you going to do about it? And so that is how we need to be in evaluation, to understand that our role is to get that branch off of people in the work that we do. There needs to be a real outcome from the work that we do, and not just walk away feeling good about ourselves because our grammar was good or we were able to have significance in whatever it is that we're doing. But there needs to be a real change, a real difference in doing that. And I believe that STEM educators can educate that way as well, and that we need to figure out how to bring social justice into the content of what it is that we do, because we know from psychology that those outcomes for the students in the classroom are humongous. So they feel better about themselves. They have a sense of belonging. They have a purpose. They can apply their interests. There's a lot of personal satisfaction in the way in which they live. So it has a lot of amazing outcomes that can also translate into persistence and lower attrition in our programs, so that they go out and actually go into those fields, and we get more professionals who are or STEM people who have personal and professional satisfaction and not burnout and go running somewhere else to another profession or another major when they're in school. So we believe that there are ways that we can educate people to be able to do that. And I'll put our company, the website. So if you want to be able to tap into some of the white papers that we have up, some of the videos that we have up, sometimes we do trainings and put those on. We do webinars and so on. But that was just me. I just got tired in COVID and just said, I'm done. This is what we need to do. And it needs to be done outside of academia, because I don't feel like going through all the channels to ask, can I do this? Can I do that? So we just started putting this information up.
That's fantastic. Dr. LaWanda Cummings also touches on the advocacy piece, which I think is really important. That's kind of what popped into my mind when we were talking some more about resilience and kind of unpacking that a little bit. And she mentions advocacy, the importance of advocacy in demonstrating that, right, and modeling that for students. Even from my perspective, right, bringing it into the classroom, I think you touched on that as well, how we can be more intentional in what content we share in the classroom. I teach research methods, so I intentionally share about the injustices, right, and ethical and unethical practices that have occurred in both African American communities, Latinx communities, as well as their indigenous communities, the history of all of that. They may never hear this again, right? It's an opportunity for us to step into that space. Do you have other suggestions for other strategies that you can recommend for those who may be evaluators / educators or evaluating, right, those spaces and providing recommendations with an equity lens?
Oh, Dr. Soto, thank you so much for that commercial. So I'm doing a session tomorrow and we're talking about emancipatory evaluation. And so I've been putting out this whole thing talking about what is emancipatory research and evaluation and how is it different from like CPAR and all of that and what's unique about it. And we will be talking about that tomorrow. And talking about the approach that we use, what is that, and then also what happened when we use that approach with an evaluation and the resistance that we got from a whole school district. So we're going to talk about that and deconstruct what happened with that. But we will talk about emancipatory research methods and how we use that in program evaluation. And that's something that Angelicque and I have been talking about and talking about the need for that. And we know that some of that work is informed by some of the work of the Maori folks and also in Australia and the work that they've been doing with indigenous methodologies and some of Linda Smith's work, right? But also thinking about some of these other things that have come out through qualitative research and so on. But this is an approach that is very much culture-centered and uses culture as the center for engaging in the work. And so, yeah, we'll be talking about that tomorrow.
Fantastic. And so you had shared, I think, a link where people can go and get that information as well, right? If they wanted to sign up and join.
Mm-hmm.
So we're at CREA, right? And you did touch on, right, the stepping into the evaluator space as well and bringing this to the forefront. The frustrations that I have, I'm sure some others may have as well, is sometimes the limitations of what government funded programming may impose. And when we're evaluating these systems, we're limited by the terminology or the language that's used. Even within what terms you can use to describe diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the lens that you are limited through those terms. What have you encountered? What frustrates you, and what do you recommend those of us who are disgruntled do as a strategy to kind of, right, whether it's do that U-turn as Dr. Blackman mentioned, right? Take one of those U-turns to circumvent some of these things and be able to address the key issues that we encounter in educational systems.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to share that one strategy is to use the frustration as an indicator of something that, let me speak for myself. I use the frustration as an indicator of something else that I need to be working on within. Because as an evaluator, we're there, I kind of liken it to a mirror. We are showing the program what they're doing, how they're engaging each other, and basically using the data that the program stakeholders or participants are sharing behaviorally, curricular-wise, all the different types of data. So whenever there is frustration, for me, that is an indicator that it's some more work I need to do, because it gives more insight. And one of the recommendations I would have for this work is to always be in reflection about your embodied experiences, about how something is landing for you. And then when it starts to land kind of strangely, to then query again and again, because we're really good at asking other people a whole lot of questions, but the work from my perspective is the questioning of ourselves. And so that's my initial response to your question. Unless you are contributing to the data, then the frustration of behaviors and comments may be more telling of some more work. The language part, my perspective is that we are all very intelligent. So we don't have to use the jargon language. We can take a word from the education evaluation space and make it more accessible. It's something I've been thinking about and trying to write about for a really long time, is how just the language we use it denies access. Because people are intelligent, they can understand things, but if we use a language that they've never heard, then it makes them seem like they can't comprehend, when in reality, it's some more work that we could do, which is just translate, use some common language, use some regular words that we know people have heard. And that's not beneath us if we are really about the benefit and value add to the communities of which we're serving. So those are my perspectives about that.
Mhm. So the thing is that, at least in my words, emancipatory research is what I call transsubjective. So there is a mutuality in which the evaluator walks away with something. So we're bringing something to communities, but we need to understand that communities are bringing something to us. And that when we engage in this work, we should expect transformation on our part, that we walk away better humans as a result of our interactions, of the gifts that people are giving us. So unless we engage in this work with mutuality, meaning I'm bringing something, but they're bringing something too, and that there's going to be something that's going to help me to be a better person as a result of engaging in this. So I'm not dropping knowledge on them and walking away. I'm coming in expecting something to happen to me as a result of the interaction. And that is going to take us to places that we haven't talked about before. So it's going to take us to places that involve humility. It's going to take us to places that involve self-awareness. It's going to take us to places that allow us to get some inner vision, as opposed to having some insight into the community that we're exploring. Instead, we'll get some inner, and I mean it the way, the songs go, inner vision. We will be looking inward to ourselves to understand that with the assistance of the community people. And we have to learn how to do that. That's not something that's just going to happen, because we can't go in thinking, oh, I want them to do me something. We don't want that either. So we're not going in expecting them to do something magical and all of that. It is about just bringing yourself to the table, but also maintaining what it is that your training, that's important as well. But you've got to be able to have some mutuality of how do those things come together to increase the trustworthiness and the truthfulness and the veracity of what it is that we see, which is missing in a lot of the work that's out there, that, the truth isn't in it. And so we have to learn how to be more truthful in our investigations. But to do that, there has to be personal transformation.
What a great point about us keeping ourselves accountable, right? And staying humble in every and all spaces. Wanted to go to a comment by Dr. Cummings again. I'm also interested in the role of secondary trauma for faculty through students' experiences of radicalized violence / exposure to the particular pandemic that shows up manifesting in this realm. And I'm trying, yes. And so any thoughts on that? Secondary trauma of what we're seeing right now in our current times.
Yeah, I would say that it's a loop. It's primary, we're getting our initial exposure through our own interactions. We're getting the secondary trauma of watching it, of hearing it. We're getting tertiary trauma. It's multi-layered. Why stop there? We're getting it through our parents and our parents' perspectives. I don't know how many of you have talked about what you saw, certainly last summer, as an example of 2020, and had conversations with your parents and grandparents. That's a trip. It's like, because they start talking about other traumas that they have had in their lifetime. And so it's not, I'm not even sure if it's linear of us looking at it in just our time, that to really understand the trauma, we have to look across generations to be able to see. But just like Ashley said, also get those nuggets of transgenerational resilience. So as we watch these things that are occurring on TV, as we listen to these young people talk about their experiences, we do want to also draw them to other things as well. So we want to validate what they're experiencing, but also say, yeah, but what else did you see? You know, what also did you see? So that's a little bit more complex to be able to say that good and bad exist simultaneously, and that we have to learn how to deal with that and use that in order for us to move forward. Otherwise, there's no hope. So we always, the only thing we've got is young people. So we want them to be hopeful. So we've got to redirect them to say, yes, that does exist. Also, what else do you see, so that they can be hopeful about tomorrow?
That's great. Trying to look at the comments here. They've blossomed all of a sudden. I'm gonna go to, is it Rowan Stern? He's asking if you're seeing cultural perspectives and knowledge of science and technology influencing STEM curriculum.
Somewhat, but through the change or insertion of some representation in textbooks, or some imagery of diverse people. Is it enough? I know that's not part of the question, but I just don't think what is being done is, we do have some examples. So NSF has funded programs that really are intentional about infusing, for example, culture of weaving into mathematics or braiding. So there are some examples. Does it happen kind of like on a regular basis across K-12 or in college? I just don't think so, and not enough. And so you can go through a STEM curricula for many years and not really fully have a grasp on the deep contributions of people of color for many years to the practices of today. I mean, we have the HeLa cells, for example, and biology majors learn about those. They learn how to go gain access to them, but how often are people infusing the fact that these are cells that were obtained from an African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks? I mean, that kind of intentional infusion of Black folks' contributions to STEM is not fully there. I will end there at that, because I could talk about this for the rest of today. But we have a lot more work to do in terms of making sure people understand that no, it's not just Bill Gates who, was the engineer of a computer. Mark Dean was before him. That kind of knowledge that is brought to the table on purpose, and not like as a separate, oh, these Black people did something, let's talk about them for a little bit of time, but the rest of the time we're gonna, continue to move forward on other folks and what they've done. Vivian Thomas, I think that's the name. We often don't know that that heart surgeons were white male heart surgeons, were trained by African Americans. I think I'm trying to remember his name. Vivian Thomas is, I think, the name. But there's so many, I can just keep going and going. But I do think being intentional, like I said, now for the third time, is more intentionality is needed.
Most definitely. It has to be to some extent, right, planned and intentional in terms of being able to implement these types of practices and curriculum. I don't see any questions. Let me see if any new ones popped up. Now we have a few more minutes before we close the session, about 15 minutes or so. So maybe if we can go back to the modeling portion, we touched on it. I think maybe another question popped up, but we touched on it a bit as well. But in terms of bringing into the classroom that responsibility that sometimes gets put on faculty of color to be that support system for students of color, which can in and of itself total sidebar and a total another element of it be right taxing a taxing expectation. But if we focus on right those students that are there now in front of us, how can we help them sort of re-embrace or remember that remembrance, right, in a positive light to continue to push forward in their careers? What types of healthy strategies, suggestions can we provide them to hopefully alleviate some of those challenges that they may encounter to continue that healing process?
Angelicque, I'll let you go first.
Are you pitching it back to me?
No, Angelicque, you're it's muted.
I'm sorry, I'm on mute. I'm sorry, I'm just talking, I'm on mute. So was the question, how can we help students move through the healing process?
Right, what strategies and how can we better equip them, right, to move through that healing process, to build that lens and navigate the systems more adequately. So and maybe I can give you an example in terms of contextualizing it further. Some of the inner city students that I work with at the city college level come in obviously ambitious, right, and they have hopes but they also come in like feeling like everyone's against them. So how can we help them kind of tease out those situations a little bit better so that every situation doesn't get magnified? Yet, to your earlier point, Dr. West, that they feel validated and acknowledged, right? Because a lot of times there is a lot of truth and weight to those negative, harsh experiences that they're going to encounter, right? And so you don't want to discount or dismiss. But how can we, right, provide them those tools in that lens of it's not always against you, right? It's not always about you, and how to kind of tease through that a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would say it's important to connect them to the community. So we need to provide students with the opportunity to connect with the local community where they are. I think students appreciate that a lot. It contextualizes what it is that they're learning. Sometimes we can be so academic that students need to study because of some carrot at the end. They're going to get a good job or they're going to do whatever. But sometimes people need immediate results of what it is that they're doing. So I think it's important to have activities where young people do things. I remember way back before I started my graduate studies, I had a job as an admissions counselor at an engineering school. And I felt responsibility to these students because this was way back, so I'm old, when, you know, really there was no diversity, not women, not students of color. And I was literally going to people's homes. I was meeting parents and going into their homes and guaranteeing that their kids were going to have a good experience. And their parents were not sending their kids to college. They were sending them to me. And I was like 20 something years old at the time, but I felt responsible for those kids once they got to campus. So I was concerned about the quality of their lives. And I saw that they were languishing. I didn't know a lot like I do now about all of that, but I could see that they were struggling in that environment. And these were mostly Black and brown kids. Where I'd gone to Puerto Rico, I had gone to Mexico, I had gone to the Southeast, to the Northwest. I just literally handpicked these kids to come to school. So I said, I saw that the local utilities company was giving away plots of land and you could have a little garden. So I asked students, were they interested? And we caravan to the plot, our little plot number 14 or whatever it was. And I had the garden tools and we built a garden, and harvested and then cooked with it. So, I mean, that took all year to be able to do that, but it helped them with a sense of belonging. It gave them a sense of purpose. It connected them to the land, to the earth. It literally grounded them in that experience. I also connected them to local neighborhood people so that they could also feel that grounding from real people with real lives who have nothing to do with the, you know, that the artificialness of academia. And that was very helpful to them as well, to put this in a broader context that the world is not going to end because such and such happened to you, that you will get by. And they also needed to have pseudo parents. They needed to have mothers and fathers and aunts and uncles and grandparents that may not be blood relatives, but people who care about them and will love them and provide them with emotional support. So those are some sort of structural, systemic things that can happen for students because, we all can wallow in self-pity and there is a place for that. But in the end, after we dry our eyes, we get up, dust ourselves off and get back there in the fray. And they won't know how to do that unless they meet people who do that on a daily basis in these other contexts. So they need to see those. But also some of the other things that people are talking about, they can do it vicariously by reading, watching movies. We can Skype somebody into the classroom who can talk about application of where does this go? How does it change things? And so on. And also for them to think about as rigid as this world is, there are these little spaces where we can flex our wings and fly by working on an assignment. Let that assignment be about something that matters to you. Figure out how to do that. And if the professor's not doing it, then connect them with other people who can show them how do you bend this world to colorize it, to culturalize it, to make it your own. And they won't know necessarily how to do that on their own, but I think we can help them to be able to do that.
And that's the beauty of your model in terms of looking at that self-awareness piece that I loved so much. So we do have a question from Carol Askew. Doctors Tucker and Blackman and Dr. West Olatunji, may you please share more about the context you are most inspired in depositing and cradling this work?
The context that we're most inspired to do, say the last part?
In depositing and cradling this work.
In depositing and cradling this work, the context would be the entirety of education, K through 20, the entirety of it. That's how I'm thinking about it. Honestly, I just really think the public education system is something that is set up with the philosophical underpinning of negative reinforcement, and as if that's how all of us as humans respond and need in order to do better. And we know enough now to understand that that's a major limitation in the kind of framework of educating people. So I'm thinking the entirety of education, especially, but my particular interest is for students of color who have been characterized in ways that are incomplete and in a lot of instances just flat out wrong. And the reckoning of that and the undoing of it is the rest of my life's work, and anyone who will join me in getting this work finished. And Dr. Olatunji has been walking and collaborating with me for a lot of years, because you can experience the trauma of low expectations in elementary school around your mathematical competencies or your science abilities. You can experience the trauma of benign neglect, and that's what it's called in the literature. And that moves with you for a really long time until there is some self-healing and some acknowledgement that I'm going to color this world like I think it needs to be colored. And I'm going to infuse myself in these spaces that I know the people don't think I should be here, but I'm here. And so that's my response. It's not, I think we use this term purpose-driven work. I would take it a step further and say, this is my life's work. This is what I was placed here in the earth to get done. And that's what I'm planning to do. So I hope that answered your question.
Dr. West, any thoughts?
Ditto.
Ditto. Love it. So we're down to our last few nuggets of time here, but I did want to bring us up a statement by Veronica Smith. First, of course, she thanks both of you, as many others have thanked you in the chat for your great leadership in this work. But she's asking about a list of Black and Brown scholars, individuals, women who have been pioneers in STEM, and able to, so that we can raise them up. And I will share Dr. Ruth Zambrana on a different project that I did recently with the National Library of Medicine's documented and is continually documenting for Latinx, particularly women. So if you're interested, I could share that, but I'll let you both speak to what you know.
A great resource would be, and it's a comprehensive resource, and it's an NSF-funded body of work. It's pretty amazing, but it's called The Science Makers. And it's a part of History Makers. It's a museum, it's in Chicago. So I'm gonna put the link in the chat, but that's a great place to start.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Oops, I put the History Makers in there, but as a part of it is the Science Makers.
Well, in our last minute or so, I just wanted to, again, take a moment to thank our speakers for sharing not just their professional expertise, but their personal, because the personal comes with it, right? Packaging the personal experiences that they've had, their lived experiences, and how that's shaped the work that they do. It's just amazing. Just seeing how you just spoke about how it's recently evolved as well, and how you continue to build on this, that this is not something new, and how important and valuable it is. It reminded me of a conversation that I had with someone from a school district who talked about how she was tasked with trying to translate the Hispanic Education Act for parents so that they could understand what it meant, what their rights were, and how that didn't do it justice, because it was framed through a lens, even if it were perfectly translated into Spanish, it would be framed through a lens of the status quo, which has been, right, historically perpetuating structural violence, systemic racism. So it's built on that kind of frame and lens, and how it just wouldn't be enough. So as you continue, all of you, to step into this work, I call on you to validate the voices of your students, validate yourselves, immerse yourselves in self-care and self-awareness, stay humble and kind. And again, many, many, many thanks to all of you for joining us throughout the session, for your comments. And again, our esteemed speakers, Dr. Tucker Blackman and Dr. West Olatunji. Thank you so very much. Please take a moment to complete the post-session evaluation after the conference, please, please, please. And again, many, many thanks. Please be kind to one another. Peace and love.